Hey, welcome back. I'm going to be honest with you. I had a different episode planned for today. And then the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Louisiana v. Calais, and I put that other episode in a drawer. Because I can't talk about what the levy said without talking about what happened. And I can't talk about what happened without talking about what this story has been trying to say all along. So let's get into it. 6-3, partisan lines. The court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, specifically the majority-minority district that had been drawn to give Black voters in Louisiana meaningful representation in Congress.
The majority's reasoning, stripped of its legal dressing, goes something like this. Race-conscious remedies for racial injuries are themselves a form of racial discrimination. In other words, the cure is the disease. The people who were systematically excluded for a century are now, by asking for inclusion, the ones causing the problem. Elena Kagan's dissent called it what it was. She said the majority had effectively gutted whatever remained of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That's not hyperbole, that's the record, and I sat with that for a while before I started writing this. Now, let me take you to Belmont. Fictional Belmont, Louisiana, St. James Parish, 40 miles southeast of Baton Rouge, right along the Mississippi River levee. In What the Levee Said, Belmont is a town that has never, not once in its history, operated under the assumption that Black residents had an equal claim to power, land, water, or truth. The Leopard Society doesn't need to announce that. It doesn't need a manifesto. It works the way actual systems of power work, quietly, through paperwork, through property transfers, through who gets a permit and who doesn't, through who sits on the school board and who gets their history called folklore in a classroom. In chapter 5 of my book, a young Black boy named Dante Williams stands up in Mrs. DeRoche's history class and talks about what his family lived through, what the 1927 flood actually did to Libreville, who actually blew that levee. And Mrs. DeRoche cuts him off. She calls it folklore. She gives extra time to a white student's presentation about the Miss St. James Parish Sugar Queen pageant. That is not a caricature. That is Louisiana. That is the mechanism by which official history launders itself. Here's what the Callais decision means in Belmont terms. The protagonist of my book, Chantal Perrier, is 12 years old. She is brilliant. She is biracial, she is gender nonconforming, she is the daughter of a woman Belmont's ruling class considered a stain. She has spent the better part of a year collecting evidence, physical evidence, documentary evidence, recorded testimony that the most powerful families in her parish conspired to steal land, poison water, murder a journalist, and then maintain that order for 60 years through control of every institution in the parish. The sheriff's office, the courts, the school board, the church, the newspapers. She makes straight A's. She wins a regional science fair. She does everything right. She goes through the proper channels. She submits her evidence to law enforcement, and Belmont sends men in a black sedan to search her bedroom. The lesson Belmont has always taught, and the lesson Louisiana versus Calais just taught from the highest court in the country, is this: the rules were not written for you. And when you use the rules well enough to threaten us, we will change the rules. Let's talk about the Voting Rights Act for a moment. 1965. Lyndon Johnson signs it into law after Selma, after John Lewis's skull gets fractured on the Edmund Pettus Bridge by Alabama state troopers. The VRA was not a gift. It was extracted. It was the result of people absorbing violence in public, on camera, until the national conscience could no longer look away. And for 50 years, it worked. Imperfectly, incompletely, but it worked. Section 2 gave courts the authority to strike down voting maps drawn to dilute Black political power. Now that provision, as applied to Louisiana, as applied to the very state where what the levee said is set, has been gutted because the Supreme Court's conservative majority decided that drawing a district for Black voters looks too much like the racial gerrymandering that historically drew districts against them. That logic would be almost elegant if it weren't so dangerous, because what it does functionally is tell people like the descendants of Libreville, the community that was flooded out, bought out, poisoned out and then watched their land turned into a petrochemical corridor. That the remedy for systematic exclusion is color blindness. Just stop seeing race. Just pretend the levee blew itself. Corinne Miller Perrier understood this. She was 19 years old. She had a scholarship to LSU. She was writing for the Daily Reveille, following the money, naming names, connecting the flood to the land transfers, to the industrial development, to the ongoing poisoning of a community that had been deliberately made invisible. She understood, the way young Black journalists in the South have always understood at cost, that systems don't reform themselves. That the courthouse and the church and the newspaper and the sheriff's office are not separate institutions with separate interests. They are one institution with one interest, the preservation of the arrangement. She got too close. She disappeared 3 days after giving birth to her daughter. And the court just said the Voting Rights Act, the last major structural tool for dismantling that arrangement, no longer applies the way you thought it did. Here's what I keep coming back to. Chantal Perrier is not an optimist. She is not in any sentimental way a believer in institutions. She does not think the system will save her. She watched her father get drugged and discarded. She watched her mother get erased. She watched Mrs. DeRoche cut Dante off in the middle of the truth. But she keeps going, not because she thinks the system will eventually reward her diligence. She keeps going because she has her mother's evidence in a cobalt blue box with leopard engravings. Because she has microfilm buried in a graveyard. Because she has a corkboard covered in red yarn connecting names and dates and transfers of title that tell a story the Leopard Society spent 60 years trying to suppress. Her theology, and I use that word intentionally because this story is built on a theology of defiance. Her theology is not that justice is inevitable. It is that truth is its own act of resistance, that bearing witness is not passive, that the act of documentation, of refusing to let the record be laundered, is itself a form of power. The Daily Reveille couldn't stop the Leopard Society. The Voting Rights Act couldn't stop Louisiana's gerrymandering. The Supreme Court just made sure of that, but Corinne wrote it down, Chantal found it, and now it exists. A final thought. The decision in Calais is going to have real consequences for real people in real Louisiana parishes. Parishes that look a lot like the fictional St. James Parish in this story. Communities along Cancer Alley. And yes, Cancer Alley is real. And yes, it runs right through the area where this novel is set. Communities that have been fighting for decades to have their political representation reflect their actual population. The court told them, not yet, maybe never. And I think about what Reverend Josiah Williams says to Chantal at Corinne's grave. He doesn't tell her the fight was worth it. He doesn't tell her it gets better. He tells her about a 7-year-old girl who walked into the Mississippi River in a white dress and declared her faith to the congregation with a voice that didn't shake. He says, Belmont was afraid of her light. That's the story. That's always been the story. The levee didn't break by accident, and it doesn't hold by accident either. Thanks for being here.